There are few wars that have managed to inflict such devastation and long-lasting trauma on a single country than the one we are about to discuss. In the 1860s, the little landlocked nation of Paraguay, in the heart of South America, was led by a megalomaniacal autocrat into a conflict with Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, all at once. A confrontation which it simply could not win. The War of the Triple Alliance, as it has come to be called, but also known as the Paraguayan War, was the deadliest war in South American history, costing the lives of hundreds of thousands. Paraguay ended up losing over half of its entire population, driven to near extinction by their leaders' insane refusal to give up. Meanwhile, their enemies had to endure unimaginably hard fighting conditions, treading through harsh terrain, supplied with inadequate weapons, being appallingly treated, and led by some of the most incompetent commanders in military history. Today, this conflict is seldom discussed outside of the South American continent. For many of you, this may even be the first time you've ever heard about this forgotten clash of nations. After all, from a Western perspective, much of what happens in South America tends to stay in South America. Nonetheless, this war left a remarkable impact on the nations that participated in it, and has produced a litany of historiographical controversies. This war was also incredibly confusing, and is one which historians are still trying to understand to this day. As Thomas Whigham writes, quote, "The Paraguayan War enjoys the dubious distinction of being the bloodiest interstate war ever fought in South America, and yet it is easily the least understood. The Paraguayan campaign was unusual in that it went on and on beyond all reason, so much so that contemporary observers and modern historians have had a difficult time trying to understand it." There are a variety of controversial aspects of this overlooked period in history, yet nevertheless I am going to do my best to uncover the least understood war of South America. But even so, I am bound to get some things wrong, so I recommend you take what I say with a pinch of salt and do your own research. I will leave all the sources I used in the description and the end credits. With that said, let's begin. If we want to truly comprehend the madness that was this war, we will have to go back over 300 years before it started, with the Spanish and Portuguese colonization of South America. The Spanish Empire had officially agreed with Portugal that the newly found American continent belonged solely to the Spanish crown in the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. Officially, everything west of an arbitrary meridian was the property of Spain. However, this line was vague enough that when a Portuguese sailor named Pedro Alvarez Cabral veered off course and accidentally landed on the easternmost tip of South America, he deduced that he had not crossed the Tordesillas line, and founded a Portuguese colony, which became Brazil. Portuguese explorers ventured inland regularly and violated the treaty, as the meridian was never clearly drawn. This set a pattern that continued in the future, as both sides were never too clear as to where the boundaries of their colonies should meet, and whilst they would never go to war over each other over such an issue, future independent colonies would, as we shall see later. Colonization of the Americas was a particularly dark chapter in human history, one which involved the wholesale enslavement, forced assimilation, and in some cases outright extermination of the indigenous peoples who had been living there for millennia. The quote-unquote Native Americans, also known as Indians, Amerindians, Aboriginals, or whatever other name is considered to be politically correct at the present moment, had a diverse set of cultures ranging from the hunter-gatherers of the Amazonian plate to the urban centers of the Inca and Aztec empires. Over the course of the 16th century, things drastically changed for them. The introduction of smallpox, to which they had no immunity, killed off a massive portion of their numbers within only a few generations. Afterwards, The Spanish conquistadores, as they were called, were keen to exploit political divisions that existed prior to their arrival to their advantage, as was the case with Hernán Cortés in the Aztecs and Pizarro with the Incas. These new territories were soon incorporated into the Spanish domain, and the inhabitants became its new subjects. It is worth mentioning that this was not a centrally coordinated invasion from Iberia, with decision-makers in Spanish courts planning the expansion. If anything, the conquistadors were individually driven by their own adventurism and private initiative. In the Penguin History of Latin America, Edwin Williamson writes, quote, "There was no systematic program of colonization coordinated by a central agency. The two major determinants of settlement were the conquistadors' desire for precious metals and their need for a supply of labor. Both were necessary for the fulfillment of the overriding ambition of 16th century European adventurers to achieve wealth and status by acquiring land, wealth, and lordship over men." Spanish, and to a lesser extent, Portuguese adventurers were driven by tales such as El Dorado and the Seven Cities of Cibola, seeking their fortunes, at times, even against the orders of the Spanish crown. These prospectors, whilst they rarely found what they were looking for, settled inland and built towns near native settlements. These Spanish towns became colonial centers in a far-flung land, which at first operated independently, and then were eventually incorporated into the Spanish territories. It was in this environment that the explorers venturing into South America created the modern nations, who hundreds of years later participated in war. Before the arrival of the Spanish, Paraguay was inhabited by a group known as the Guarani people, a large grouping of indigenous tribes who speak the Guarani language, scattered around what is now known as the Plate region, which is southwestern Brazil and northwestern Argentina. They placed considerable value on oral traditions, which underpinned their culture and only had a technological level that was Neolithic, having not even invented the wheel. The first Spaniards they met were conquistadors in search of gold in the 1520s. At first, relations between them were cordial, as the arrivals sought to have the beneficial relationship with people who knew the land better than they did. In 1537, the explorer Juan de Salazar traveled up the river which they called El Rio de la Plata, which translates to the River of Silver, and founded the town of Asuncion, which became the main hub of Spanish activity in the region and eventually the capital city of Paraguay. When venturing outwards for expeditions, the conquistadors traded with and asked Guarani people for guidance and hospitality. Relations at this point were good enough that intermarriage between male Spaniards and female Guarani was not uncommon, which created the first generation of mestizos, which is Spanish for mixed race. Yet, as time went on, the Spaniards were unable to find the precious metals they were looking for, and their colony languished in poverty in the late 1500s. Compounding this issue was Asunción's isolation from the rest of the world, being far from many Atlantic ports. This became more evident as Buenos Aires, the future capital of Argentina, which was closer to the sea, became the main hub of Spanish domain in the region. These issues marked a critical turning point in Paraguayan history, as the Spaniards who remained there now had to turn to other means to acquire wealth and status. As the Paraguay reader puts it, with no gold or silver mines to attract further immigration from Spain, and with no outlet to the sea, Paraguay became an economic backwater and remained isolated and weakly integrated into the world economy throughout the rest of the colonial period. Henceforth, the indigenous peoples of Paraguay soon became the primary resource to be exploited by the relatively few conquistadors who remained in the province." Unquote. The friendship which existed between the local Guarani and the conquistadors quickly vanished once the Spaniards began abducting and using them as slave labor on farms or as personal concubines. Almost all the Spanish who arrived in Paraguay were men, creating an unbearable shortage of females for many of them. They solved this problem by violently kidnapping dozens of Guarani women in raids known as rancheadas, and creating massive personal harems. Some men were able to accumulate up to 70 women for themselves, and fathered hundreds of children. There were a number of rebellions by the Guarani in the 17th century, yet all of these were violently put down. This rapid and forced miscegenation between Spanish and Guarani is what created the modern ethnic Paraguayans. The mixing of the races became normalized, and today, because of a lack of further immigration into the country after the 16th century, Paraguay is one of the most ethnically homogeneous states in the Americas, with many of its inhabitants tracing their lineage to a few hundred conquistadors and their vast harems. Indeed, the name Paraguay is derived from Guarani. Another peculiarity of Paraguay is its language, or should I say, languages. Most inhabitants of Paraguay can speak both Spanish and Guarani, with the native language having been preserved through generations of interbreeding. In most Latin American states, native languages are spoken, but are often confined to areas with strong indigenous roots. The Paraguayan case is unique, as an indigenous dialect permeates every layer of society. Paraguayans have come to view themselves as having a unique identity compared to the rest of the Americas. They are neither Spanish settlers or indigenous resistors. They are in effect both. It is this identity which creates a sense of patriotism in Paraguay, one that is lacking in most other Latin American nations. Indeed, it could explain why so many Paraguayans continued to fight until the bitter end during the war, unlike Brazil and Argentina, who had to drag unwilling conscripts against massive public opposition to win. Over the colonial period, the heirs of the conquistador harems came to rule society from Asunción, and given the land's geographic isolation, it became fairly economically independent from the imperial Spanish core, even before its political independence. Paraguay's neighbours had an all too similar colonial founding, but one which followed distinct characteristics that caused them to have a fundamentally different national character. To the north was the gradual expansion of the Portuguese settlements which would eventually become Brazil. As mentioned before, the Treaty of Tordesillas allowed Portugal to create settlements on the Brazilian coast, but the modern borders of Brazil far exceed the boundary which was set by the Tordesillas meridian. This is because the cartography of the land was not advanced enough to clearly determine where the line was drawn. Portuguese explorers ventured inland as far as the Andes Mountains in search of wealth, which typically came in the form of native slaves. Members of the many hunter-gatherer tribes that inhabited the rainforests were taken from their homes and forced to work on aldeias, which at first provided the backbone of the colonial economy. When these slaves began to die in large numbers due to New World illnesses or mistreatment, the colonists resorted to importing massive amounts of African slaves to fill the role. Even so, settlers ventured ever more inland in search of indigenous tribes to subjugate, forming roaming companies known as bandeiras, whose sole mission was to round up and sell natives to sugar plantations. These slave hunters aggressively pushed the Brazilian frontier until they met with Spanish settlements, which were the only time they could be stopped. This was the case to the south when bandeiras tried to settle the northern delta of the Rio de la Plata. They were pushed out by the Spanish settlers who founded the fort city of Montevideo, which became the modern capital of Uruguay. More importantly, however, was the struggle for control over the Paraná rivers in Paraguay. Local Guarani were aided by the Jesuit missionaries fiercely resisted the incursions by the Portuguese, resulting in a long and bloody string of minor wars and even a full-scale war in 1641. Paraguay did not forget this struggle, and in the future this became a major factor in the causes of the war. The vague border issue between Brazil and its neighbors was only partially resolved in 1750 with the Treaty of Madrid, which drew on the far-reaching settlements of the Portuguese marauders, giving the rough semblance of Brazil's borders today. Even so, many of these boundaries were never fully established, as was the case with the Mato Grosso province that bordered Paraguay. To the south, the conquistador named Pedro de Mendoza arrived at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, and in 1536 founded a settlement which he called Santa Maria de los Buenos Aires. It was destroyed by Amerindians in 1540, but later rebuilt by Juan de Garay in 1580. In time, this settlement became a city and an important Spanish outpost in the south. Today it is simply known as Buenos Aires, which roughly translates to in English as good airs, or, more appropriately, fair winds. and is the capital of Argentina. Its importance to the Spanish Empire was never particularly high, however. It was only until 1776 that the Spanish crown established the governing viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, which encompasses territories that would go on to form Argentina, Uruguay, and parts of Bolivia, and most importantly, all of Paraguay. Whilst this imperial institution did not last after these countries gained their independence, it had reverberating political consequences for the future claims on sovereignty, as a future Argentina tried to in many cases use it for irredentist claims. The stage had been set for geopolitical bickering in a future when all these nations had a sovereignty of their own, bickering that would ultimately turn into devastating violence. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded and occupied the Iberian Peninsula, forcing the Portuguese nobility to flee to Brazil and causing a complete collapse in royal authority in the Spanish Empire, triggering a series of events that led to the creation of independent Latin American states. The independence of the Americas and the ousting of the European empires was a particularly confusing and tumultuous period which was no simple fight between rebels and imperialists. If anything, they could range from large-scale uprisings against local elites, regional power grabs by warlords, and civil wars between different groups as the imperial order completely broke down. In Mexico, rebellions began in earnest when a priest named Miguel Hidalgo called for a general uprising in 1810 against the Spanish authorities. Amerindian and mestizo peasants who had been suffering from long periods of drought were soon up in arms and began an insurrection which involved genocidal levels of violence against the white elites. The rebellion was eventually put down, but only after around 500,000 people died in the conflict, around 1/10 of Mexico's population at the time. Down south in the city of Caracas, the now capital of Venezuela, saw an insurrection led by the famous Simón Bolívar, who sought to create an independent state of Gran Colombia. This was also put down in 1815, but Bolívar was able to flee and return in 1820 after a large contingent of the Spanish army mutinied, allowing for a round two in the bid of independence. Bolívar, along with several other warlords, were able to defeat the Spanish and take the viceroyalty of New Granada. The independence of Brazil was somewhat strange. Instead of there being any mass uprisings or violent insurrections, the colony remained relatively peaceful throughout the Napoleonic occupation of Portugal. It was only after the French left when instability arose. The new Portugal was now under the control of liberals who demanded the king cede his power to create a constitutional monarchy. Dom Pedro, the king of the time, instead remained in Brazil and declared independence, creating the Empire of Brazil. Finally, there was the rebellion in the Rio de la Plata viceroyalty. Events kicked off in 1810 when the military junta seized power in Buenos Aires and declared independence, forming the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, which eventually became Argentina. Paraguay, however, remained officially under Spanish control, which prompted the rebels to organize an invasion force to liberate it. However, the process was not straightforward, as many Paraguayans saw this as an invasion by another would-be oppressor. They formed a militia which defeated the army from Buenos Aires. This militia then turned on the governor, who was still loyal to Spain, who in turn requested aid from Brazil to crush the uprising. This was also thwarted, and in 1812, Paraguay had won its freedom. Uruguay, at the time known as La Banda Oriental, was not so lucky. 1811 saw a rebellion against Spanish rule in Montevideo, which was successful, but it soon fell prey to its neighbors, that being Brazil and Argentina. Between 1811 and 1828, an ever-shifting web of alliances and imperial domination created what became known as the Cisplatin War. It only ended when Britain forced all sides to sign the Treaty of Montevideo, which recognized Uruguay's independence. Even so, Uruguayan society remained highly polarized and dominated by its neighbors, creating an internal political intrigue which would become highly relevant on the international scene. More on that later. For the first time, South American states were free to self-govern, yet this newfound freedom came with many perils, not least of which were the pre-existing political disputes and tensions in the past which were resolved by their imperial overlords. Now, if they wanted to settle a score, they were on their own, and nowhere would this be more evident than what's been referred to as the Plate region, where Paraguay inhabits. In its early independence, Paraguay came to be ruled by the theology PhD José Gaspar de Francia, also simply known as Dr. Francia. This might very well be the strangest autocrat in history. He was elected by the Congress in 1814 as dictator, making him the only real dictator in modern history who actually bore the title. Society under him became almost totalitarian, as businesses and farms were confiscated and private institutions, especially religious ones, were outlawed. Anything beyond primary education was forbidden, and criticism of these policies was severely punished. He pursued a policy of extreme isolationism from the outside world, forbidding trade and communication as well as making it illegal to leave or enter the country. Paraguay had effectively been turned into a hermit nation, although this had its consequences, as Thomas Whigham writes, quote, Paraguay paid dearly for this domestic tranquility. Its society languished under a regime that was as autarkic as it was orderly. This led to the strengthening of many earlier Hispano-Guarani cultural traits. Xenophobia, paternalism, and a narrow focus on the community continued, unchallenged by the seductive vagaries of the Enlightenment. The economy reverted to barter, self-sufficiency, and reciprocity. Unquote. What is perplexing about Dr. Francia was that he was not particularly corrupt. He lived a Spartan lifestyle, only living on a fraction of the salary that he was allotted by Congress, and never accepted any bribes or gifts, as well as having a strict work ethic. Nevertheless, he was still an absolute ruler who left his country in a questionable state after he was gone, albeit one who had the most impact on the formation of Paraguay as a nation. Dr. Francia's rule ended in 1840 with his death. He never married, and is widely considered to have died a virgin, as he left no heirs. Authority was inherited by his garrison of commanders, who relied on an obscure lawyer named Carlos Antonio Lopez, who became president in 1844. Antonio Lopez was more liberal than his predecessor, and removed some of the totalitarian laws that had existed prior to his rule. He also sought to modernize Paraguay, building industry, railways, and most importantly, upgrading the army. He was able to do this by exporting yerba mate, which was used to make tea, which yielded the capital necessary to purchase foreign goods and hire technical experts. Unfortunately, unlike his predecessor, he was breathlessly corrupt, and he spent lavishly on personal residences and filled important government roles with his family members, such as promoting his son, future dictator of Paraguay, Solano Lopez, to the rank of general at the age of 25. Solano Lopez came to succeed his father in 1862 upon his death. Before he came to power, Lopez had taken a tour of Europe and visited France during the reign of Napoleon III, who was the original Napoleon's nephew. He was taken in by the splendor and magnificence of what he saw, and sought to emulate it as much as possible, seeing himself as the future Napoleon of South America. In a way, this ended up being true, as he ended up facing a large coalition of armies that ended up defeating him. I would like to mention that many aspects of Solano Lopez's personal character have been exaggerated by Brazilian and Argentinian propaganda. He was not insane or maniacal as is sometimes portrayed. However, it is fairly evident that this man had an ultra-nationalist ego which led him to making massive geopolitical blunders that ended up almost causing the extinction of Paraguay as a nation. His dictatorship was characterized by an insane cult of personality, with priests ordered to give him daily prayers for his welfare, portraits of him all over public areas, and media outlets regularly deifying his status. Paraguayan society became an Orwellian police state, with people being put to death for the most innocent remarks, such as complaining about a lack of food on the table. He surrounded himself with a cabinet of sycophants and yes-men who did nothing but praise his actions, which not only meant that he would never face resistance on bad decisions, but that he would be fed false information by those who did not want to disappoint him. For more info, I'd recommend James Schofield's book, Solano Lopez and the Ruination of Paraguay. Needless to say, it had all the makings of a regime that was on a collision course with catastrophe, one that would end Paraguay's isolation in spectacular fashion. Uruguay was ultimately a minor player in the war, yet one which had a disproportionate amount of influence on its origins. The country was facing endemic issues of inequality between landowning elites, common peasants, and slaves. As a result, The country had begun its independence incredibly divided and polarized between liberals and conservatives, culminating in a civil war that lasted 15 years from 1836 to 1851, between the Colorados, or the Coloreds, and the Blancos, the Whites. There was also the fact that Uruguayans did not see themselves as a sovereign nation at the time, with most of its citizens believing that they would be a part of either Argentina or Brazil. Because of this, the party sought support from either of these giants, who were in a geopolitical struggle to gain Uruguay's allegiance. The Colorados were the Liberal Party and were backed by the Brazilian Empire under Dom Pedro II. Pedro II became emperor at the age of 5 during a highly tumultuous time in the country's history, with his father, Dom Pedro I, abdicating in 1831 due to his sheer frustration in dealing with growing slave revolts and political polarization. Because Pedro was too young to rule, the Brazilian Constitutional Court was left making all the decisions during the 1830s. This period has been referred to as the Regency, an era of chaos and unrest which involved massive slave uprisings, class conflict, and even attempts of several provinces to secede from the empire. Brazil became very close to being dismembered as a country during these trying times, yet against all odds, it was able to keep itself together until the coronation of Pedro in 1841, which stabilized things. Even so, this was a country with severe underlying problems, not least of which was the fact that over a quarter of the population was enslaved, less than 1% of its people could vote, and that it had a primitive industry which relied on coffee and sugar exports. Meanwhile, the Blancos, aka the Whites, were the conservative faction, and were backed by the Argentinian dictator Juan Manuel José Domingo Ortiz de Rosas, yes, that was his full name, a provincial warlord who used his charisma to build a fanatical base of supporters who got him elected with full dictatorial powers in 1835, a time when Argentina was crumbling at the seams with political polarization. Rosas turned out to be a particularly vicious and tyrannical autocrat who turned Argentina into a borderline totalitarian police state which regularly purged, tortured, and assassinated political dissidents whilst gutting democratic institutions such as the courts. This was whilst leading genocidal military campaigns against Argentina's Amerindian population in the south. That all said, he was able to stabilize and unite the feuding Argentinian provinces, who were on the verge of civil war before he came to power. But nonetheless, he has gone down as one of Argentina's most controversial political figures. Uruguay's civil war ebbed and flowed in the initial stages. However, things reached a boiling point when the Blancos, after being given considerable manpower by Rosas, were able to take most of the country in 1843 and lay siege to the capital, Montevideo. The Colorados were able to hold out for an amazing 7 years, long enough for the political situation in Argentina to change drastically. Rosas had become increasingly unpopular in the late 1840s, and soon, rivals began to challenge his authority. Then, in 1851, a rival general named José de Urquiza began an insurrection that was backed by Brazil. This brief campaign became known as the Plata War, and after several battles, Rosas was defeated and forced to flee the country, handing power to Urquiza and allowing for an easy peace with Brazil. The situation in Uruguay, meanwhile, had stabilized, as the people were now seeking to rebuild their country after decades of strife. The Blancos were able to cement authority over the country peacefully thanks to compromises with the Colorados and the leadership of Bernardo Berro. Yet the underlying causes of division still existed, as there were massive gulfs between the different social classes that resurfaced in the late 1860s. The peace was once again upended in 1863, when the leader of the Colorados, Venancio Flores, began an insurrection seeking to overthrow Berro. Berro at first sought help from his party's historical ally, Argentina. However, the latter showed no interest in lending any assistance in fear of getting embroiled in a foreign conflict, as well as the fact that it was led by the liberal president, Bartolomé Mitre, who had his political differences. With no other help in sight, Berro was forced to turn to his last option, Paraguay. Paraguay, up until this point, had remained largely detached from the politics of wider South America. Antonio Lopez had sought to broaden Paraguay's horizons in the 1840s, yet quickly abandoned such ambitions after a number of blunders and misunderstandings with foreign governments. not least of which was a failed military expedition into Argentina in 1846, during the Plata War to gain favour with Brazil. This ended in disaster, changing his foreign policy objectives. Solano Lopez, on the other hand, had far greater ambitions for his country. One of these was the annexation of the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso, which he and many Paraguayans claimed was a historic part of their land, which was unjustly taken by Brazilian bandeiras. This enmity towards Brazil was not helped by Brazil's actions, as Thomas Whigham writes, quote, "When Brazilians were not trying to trade with Paraguay, they were trying to subvert its authority along the frontier. The Guaicuru Indians, who had earlier raided Brazilian mining settlements in Mato Grosso, also engaged in regular attacks against the Paraguayan north. Most of these raids involved the theft of cattle, which the Indians then sold to Brazilians. Although Mato Grosso settlers could always repel the marauders, when possible, they encouraged their raiding to the south. This proved to be a constant strain for Brazilian-Paraguayan relations, one which Lopez promised to resolve. More importantly, however, was Lopez's willingness to be involved in foreign affairs. So when a desperate Uruguayan delegate of the Blanco Party came in July of 1864 to ask for his support, he considered it profoundly. It was blatantly evident at this stage that the Brazilians were assisting the Colorados, providing them with weapons and funding, and there was considerable fear that if the Colorados succeeded in the Civil War, Uruguay would be turned into a Brazilian satellite, an outcome which Lopez did not see as desirable, given his enmity towards the empire. After a month of deliberating, he made up his mind, and on the 30th of August of 1864, he issued a proclamation to Brazil. Quote, "The government of the Republic of Paraguay would consider any occupation of Uruguayan territory by the imperial forces as an attack upon the balance of power by the Plataean states, which interests the Republic of Paraguay as the guarantee of its security, peace, and prosperity. That government protests in the most solemn manner against such an act, disclaiming at once all responsibility for the present declaration." Unquote. This balance of power which Lopez spoke of was something he had picked up in his time in Europe. It was geopolitical strategic philosophy which stated that no European state could rule the whole continent, since all other European states would feel threatened and ally to crush it, in effect maintaining a balance of power. Lopez became obsessed with this, and sought to apply it to South America, believing that if Brazil conquered Uruguay, then a coalition between Paraguay and Argentina could be formed to dislodge the Brazilians. Yet its applicability in such a different continent is questionable, as the nations of the region vary greatly in size, with Paraguay only numbering roughly 500,000 citizens at a time, as opposed to Brazilians' 10 million. This is unlike Europe's nations, which have always been relatively similar. Brazil, seeing Paraguay as a shrimp that posed no credible threat, continued with their support of the Colorados, and openly sent troops to Uruguay in October. Lopez had put himself into a bind. By issuing the August proclamation, he had effectively promised the Uruguayan Blancos that aid would come, and issued a threat to Brazil. If he did nothing, it would be an embarrassing look to say the least. Yet he understood the might of the Brazilian army and the distance which Uruguay was from Asunción. He was at an unenviable geopolitical crossroads, and the fate of Paraguay hung in the balance. Paraguayan society at this point seemed like it was itching for war. Anti-Brazilian sentiment was at an all-time high, and a nationalist fervour seemed to have gripped the country after the August proclamation. Foreign delegates in Asunción talked of patriotic processions and flag hoistings occurring almost daily. Then, on October of 1864, Lopez made the famous statement, quote, "If we don't have a war with Brazil, we shall have one at a less convenient time for ourselves." Unquote. Promptly afterwards, Paraguay ceased all diplomatic relations with Brazil. Then, on the 12th of November of that year, a Brazilian steamer named the Marques de Olinda, which was sailing up the river towards Paraguay, was boarded and commandeered by a Paraguayan warship. There was no turning back now. Brazil and Paraguay were at war. Before the war, the Paraguayan army had undergone significant evolutions. Whilst it had begun as a ragtag militia of volunteers under Dr. Francia, Antonio Lopez had introduced nationwide universal conscription to all male citizens. On the eve of Solano Lopez's expeditions, he was able to quickly raise an army that was quite large for his nation's size. It is unclear exactly how large the army was in 1864, with the only reliable measure being an accounting that was conducted a year later, which measured 38,000. Other sources claim that the army numbered as high as 80,000. Regardless of which of these is true, this was a massive army for a nation of less than 500,000, and the soldiers were by all accounts enthusiastic and obedient. This was a rapid mobilization which Paraguay's enemies simply could not pull off in the initial stages of the war. The Brazilian army was up until this point used more as a policing force than a war machine. Soldiers and generals were looked down upon by politicians who regarded professions in the army as lowly. The majority of Brazilians had no loyalty to the armed forces and no intention of risking their lives in war, and as a result, the army in 1864 only numbered around 17,000 men. Argentina had similar shortcomings, with most men in arms being used to keep peace in the provinces. This was not helped by Argentina's internal political divisions, as the army was seen by the central government, quite rightly, as a threat to its existence, given the looming possibility of a military coup. Buenos Aires was even more woefully unprepared to fight than Rio de Janeiro. Once again, Thomas Whigham puts it best. Quote, "The ethos of Solano Lopez's army was entirely different from that of the Brazilians or Argentines. It was an institution that responded to national directives rather than a coterie of provincial guards with limited outlook. The army could depend on the unswerving, unquestioned patronage of the state. The two structures overlapped at so many places as to essentially become one and the same. Thus, unlike Argentina and Brazil, Paraguay could mobilize all of its men with relative ease. When it came to military hardware, things were a little different. The Paraguayan army, for all its vigor, had an irredeemable deficiency in terms of equipment and weaponry. In the past decades, the state had sought to modernize its army by importing weapons from abroad, but was never able to obtain enough to equip such a massive force. As a result, Paraguayan infantrymen were severely lacking in what they needed. Their uniforms were thin and bare, and most of them did not even have boots. The weapons they sported were smooth-bore flintlock muskets, which were in some cases over 100 years old, and they were highly inaccurate and unreliable. They were also critically lacking in field artillery, which was going to be crucial in the next few years. The Paraguayan navy also left much to be desired. Naval superiority in this war was going to be quite important, given the massive rivers of the region. Out of the 18 ships which their navy could draw upon, only 2 were dedicated warships. The other 16 were expropriated merchant ships which were not fit for battle. Meanwhile, the Brazilian navy had over 40 warships with well-trained crews. Finally, there is the difference in sheer population and economy. At the beginning of the war, Paraguay is estimated to have had around 400,000 people. Brazil had over 20 times that number, and whilst it may not have been able to conduct a rapid mobilization, over time it could raise an army that would dwarf anything Paraguay had to offer. It also had better access to the sea, being able to trade with European powers for weapons and supplies, unlike Paraguay, who would end up getting blockaded once the naval situation turned unwinnable. If Lopez was to have any chance of winning, he would need a fast, decisive victory. Lopez sent an initial invasion force in December of 1864 to capture southern Mato Grosso to the north. In the context of aiding his Uruguayan allies, this was certainly a strange move, given that it barely accomplished what he said he would do. However, Paraguayans had long believed that this was rightfully their land, and its reincorporation was paramount to his ambitions. Lopez's plan was essentially to both secure Uruguay as an ally and take a considerable portion of Brazil's land in the process. Numbering only 8,000 troops, this invasion force was surprisingly successful, as the Brazilian garrison there were few and were taken completely by surprise. Within a month, they had seized the fort of Nova Coimbra after only a brief battle, and soon afterwards, much of southern Mato Grosso had been conquered with scarce resistance. The only real obstacle they encountered was the terrain, that being humid and dense jungle and a lack of roads. Nonetheless, the Mato Grosso campaign was a success, and a large amount of weapons, supplies, and food were seized from the territory. As this happened, however, the Blancos in Uruguay were routed, and Flores was in control of Montevideo by February of 1865. This was not good for Lopez, as he had banked on Brazil still being involved in Uruguay during an attack he had planned on the province of Rio Grande do Sul, just north of Uruguay. Nevertheless, high on his recent victory in Mato Grosso, he decided to take the next piece of his enemy. Before he could do this, however, he would have to cross Argentinian territory. Argentina at the time was under the presidency of the liberal Bartolomé Mitre, who had no intention of being a rival of Brazil's. However, his regime was unstable, as the warlord Urquiza, who previously deposed Rosas, was a powerful rival of his, and one who posed a looming threat of a violent uprising. Lopez was aware of the situation, and believed that because of this, Argentina could not involve itself in a war against him, since Urquiza would seize the opportunity and depose Mitre. And so, Lopez went and attacked the Argentinian provinces of Misiones and Corrientes in April of 1865, with the aim to use them as a stepping stone for the invasion of do Sul. Like the Brazilians, the Argentinian garrisons were taken off guard and felled without much of a fight the Paraguayan steamers who sailed down the Paraná. This, however, was a Pyrrhic victory, as the uprising by Urquiza which Lopez had hoped for never happened. Instead, Argentinian society was now enraged and demanded an all-out war against Paraguay. Public opinion of Paraguay's actions throughout the region were negative, to say the least. The attack and seizure of Mato Grosso had enraged Brazilians, both ordinary and elite, and Lopez soon came to be depicted as a fat, brainless, warmongering orangutan. The Parliament and the Emperor agreed that he needed to be put down and taught a lesson, and very quickly an army of unpaid volunteers began to grow, with many of them having ties to Mato Grosso, whose reconquest was a priority. Argentina had been massively angered by Lopez's brash actions, and far from the uprising by Urquiza which Lopez had hoped for, the country had united against him. Instead, what resurfaced were old Argentinian claims on Paraguayan territory based on the old viceroyalty of La Plata. Meanwhile, Uruguay was now under the full control of Flores and was now effectively an enemy of Paraguay. It was under these circumstances that the Treaty of the Triple Alliance came to be formed. In late April of 1865, Argentina and Brazil entered negotiations to create a military agreement to deal with the unexpected aggression from Lopez. Uruguay was soon added, and on the 1st of May the treaty was fully ratified. The primary stipulations of the treaty were the removal of Lopez and the eradication of his dictatorship. Officially, it made no mention of the annexation of Paraguayan territory, stressing that the people of the region should have autonomy and that this was a war between civilization and barbarism. However, it had several secret clauses which gave Brazil and Argentina rights to parts of the country. President Mitre even demanded that Paraguay be completely absorbed, yet this was turned down by Brazil, who saw Paraguay's usefulness as a buffer state between the two. Finally, I think it is worth I dispel a claim that is held significantly in South America, that being that the British orchestrated and manipulated the entire war for their gain, being referred to as the Fourth Ally by many ideologues. It is true that the British did have a small hand in the creation of the Triple Alliance, and they were always open supporters of the Allies. As Leslie Bethel writes, most British officials favoured the Allies. They were critical of the Solano Lopez regime. They had contempt for the Paraguayans, and they generally blamed Paraguay for the war. For them, as for Brazilians and Argentines, the war came to represent civilization and progress versus backwardness and barbarism. British interests were obviously greater in Brazil and Argentina than in Paraguay. Britain's role in the war would ultimately be minor, ensuring that commerce in the River Plate remained stable, whilst respecting the blockade that the Allies enforced. However, the evidence for the British having orchestrated the war from the beginning is non-existent. More on that when I talk about the historiography of this war. Lopez needed complete control of the Paraná River in order to conduct aggressive action on Brazil, as well as ensure that the alliance could not rapidly mobilize offensive action on Paraguay. Given the inherent superiority of the Brazilian fleet, this required a stealthy and rapid operation to completely destroy the enemy warships without directly confronting them in a conventional engagement, since their greater firepower would overwhelm them. On the 11th of June of 1865, Admiral Mesa departed from the naval base in Humaitá with 9 ships, with the intent to create a surprise attack against the anchored Brazilian fleet downstream in Riachuelo, scoring a decisive blow. Unfortunately, this plan had major flaws from the beginning, as it relied on there being low visibility due to fog, yet by the time Messas arrived, the area was extremely clear. They also underestimated the preparedness of the enemy. The fleet at the time was led by Admiral Barroso, a cautious and diligent leader who had suspected this sort of attack for a while. The Paraguayan fleet had also suffered a critical delay after the departure, as one of their ships, the Ibora, apparently broke down and took several hours to be repaired. Messas had originally intended for the attack to begin by night, but the mishap made it so that they arrived at the target by midday. Nevertheless, Messas continued with the plan and steamed down the river until he came within sight of the enemy. The Brazilian ships were deployed in a line next to the riverbank, and the sailors, who had just been enjoying the morning sun, panicked at the sudden appearance of the Paraguayan ships. Once in range, Mesa ordered his ships to open fire, sending a volley of shells. Unfortunately, Mesa had underestimated the armor on the Brazilian warships, and the initial attack did little damage. The Brazilian response was delayed, but Barroso soon sent a counter-volley at the Paraguayan fleet, which inflicted considerably more damage, putting 2 of Messas' ships out of action. Feeling like the tide had turned against him, Mesa decided to retreat, and Barroso gave pursuit. The ensuing battle went on for 4 hours, and was a disaster for Paraguay, with Mesa losing 4 warships, as opposed to Brazil, who only lost 1. The Battle of Riachuelo had proven to be a decisive victory for the Alliance, as naval superiority in the rivers had been achieved for the rest of the war. Now, the naval blockade could be conducted against Paraguay, preventing any help from abroad from getting in. Not much later, Paraguayan forces led by General Estigarribia suffered a terrible defeat in Rio Grande do Sul province. On August of 1865, the Paraguayan army made an incursion into Brazil, capturing the small city of Uruguayana. They thrust deeper into enemy territory, yet by this point, the Alliance had been able to assemble a much larger army of around 16,000 troops. President Flores of Uruguay himself met the invaders at the Battle of Yatay of the 17th of August, where he was able to outmaneuver and rout his enemy, inflicting severe casualties with minimal losses. Estigarribia was forced back to his position in Uruguayana, which he garrisoned with 8,000 troops. The Allies decided to surround the city, knowing that the Paraguayans inside had little food or supplies. The siege only lasted for 4 days, and Estigarribia surrendered to the Alliance on the 18th of September, effectively losing all ground gained in Rio Grande. With such military defeats, the situation for Paraguay had turned completely unwinnable less than a year into the war. All the early initiative it had, as well as any element of surprise, was gone, as it was now facing 3 nations with a combined population over 30 times its own. Lopez despaired, knowing that the quick war of conquest he had fantasized over was out of his grasp. However, this struggle was still far from over, as the Alliance was now preparing to invade Paraguay and bring him down. Lopez may not have been able to achieve shock and awe, but he was not going to go quietly. The War of the Triple Alliance was marked by a particularly high level of lethality and hardship for combatants. Being bunched into closely packed regiments with primitive sanitation meant that the greatest cause of death for many of them was not necessarily combat, but illness, specifically malaria, which was common in the hot and humid landscape. Other diseases included cholera and smallpox, the treatments for which were either ineffective or non-existent. Even the very fauna of the land could pose a threat, as hundreds of men were killed by venomous snakes and spiders when marching into the jungle unprepared. It was common for soldiers to die agonizing deaths in makeshift army camp infirmaries before ever seeing combat, and throughout the war, neither side gave adequate attention to the medical well-being of the troops. The Road to Armageddon gives a grisly description of a Brazilian field hospital. Quote, "The surgeon's tent had the appearance of a nocturnal slaughterhouse. The oil lamps gave off an eerie, intermittent light, whose flickering made work difficult and uncertain. The balls of shrapnel had mangled many men beyond recognition, and limbs could not always be saved. Scores of wounded soldiers passed into the tents, and amid their cries of pity, the doctors sawed off arms and legs, throwing them into a grisly pile before sponging down tables and starting over. Military chaplains offered spiritual relief to the dying and solace to the survivors, but most of men could not hear their words." Logistics and supplies were also abysmal. The lack of paved roads and competence by military planners meant fighters were often at a shortage of food and other essential goods. There were times when troops had to subsist on rotten and stale bread to avoid starvation. This also led armies to raid civilian settlements and plunder the country farmland for sustenance, which made life difficult for non-combatant bystanders. The civilians sometimes tried to defend their property and livelihoods, which often ended in violent clashes that got them killed. Many soldiers also became starved of their sexual desires, and quite a few of them took to violently abusing civilian women when they came across them. This war also may be one of the most incompetently fought wars in human history, with commanders on both sides displaying a remarkable level of ineptness. Both the Paraguayans and the Alliance often promoted generals not based on experience or talent, but through nepotism and social standing. This was especially true with Paraguay, which had several high-ranking generals that weren't even literate. They rarely made effective use of communication and intelligence, often haphazardly sending ill-coordinated attacks, or not even attacking when the opportunity arose. There are several instances of generals getting lost in the wilderness with their armies when trying to reach their destination, since they could not read a map, or simply had not been provided with one. All of these factors were compounded by the introduction of modern weaponry, which exhibited a level of deadliness yet unseen in the region, although these were mostly only available to the Alliance. Modern artillery and accurate rifles allowed for precise killing, and this inherent advantage to the Allies meant that Paraguay almost always suffered more casualties in battle. Even so, this was not enough for the Allies to gain a swift victory, whose own incompetence got them bogged down in the Paraguayan swamps, which they seemed unable to navigate, costing them many lives. This devolved into an early version of trench warfare, with both sides camped in dugouts facing no man's land, waiting for the other side to attack or go over the top and attempt to overwhelm the enemy, creating a grim prelude to the fighting of World War I 50 years later. Despite their recent victory at Uruguayana, the Alliance still had over 5 years of vicious fighting ahead of them. Their armies had fully mobilized, and the morale of the troops was decent by most accounts. However, they operated under a disunified structure, and there were still many differences between their objectives and political motivations, which made military coordination difficult. The Allies desperately needed a single figure who could bring together the armies of the different nations under a unified command, akin to an Eisenhower bringing together the Allied nations of World War II. Fortunately, it got one in the form of a Brazilian general named Luiz Alves de Lima e Silva, also known as the Duke of Caxias. An experienced veteran of the Cisplatin War, Silva was both militarily competent and diplomatic, knowing how to appropriately communicate with his Argentinian and Uruguayan counterparts. By 1865, he had been appointed as the commander-in-chief of all Brazilian forces, and a year later, he was effectively the supreme commander of the entire Allied front. The nations of the Alliance also had to contend with internal problems that could alter their fighting resolve. Argentina was currently dealing with a revolt of the Patagonian Amerindians, and President Mitre feared that if the fighting dragged on for too long, the country could face rebellions from its provinces, who were in a tense political standoff with Buenos Aires. Uruguay was facing similar issues, as remnants of the Blanco Party were opposed to the war and did everything they could to sabotage the effort. Once again, Brazil's participation became indispensable to the Allies, as it was in a stable enough position to continue the conflict. Even then, Brazil still faced public opposition to the war in the later years, as more resources were siphoned off to the war machine, creating a severe burden on the economy. In a way, the war was less a test of strategic prowess for the Allies, and more a trial of military endurance and political resolve. Paraguay could be easily defeated on the open battlefield, but destroying its leadership and capacity to fight as the Alliance had set about to do from the start was going to bring about its own set of hard challenges. As the year of 1865 ended, plans were being drawn for an attack into Paraguay. A large force began to assemble at the edge of the Paraná, intending to cross a shallow ford into enemy land once conditions presented themselves. On the other side of the river, Lopez built his own encampment, building up a force of 30,000. He had no intention of merely waiting for an attack, choosing to send regular raids into the enemy. Hundreds of Paraguayan soldiers crossed the river in canoes during January of 1866, with the mission of harassing the Alliance with hit-and-run raids. The largest of these raids came on the 31st of January, when over 1,000 soldiers were sent to attack the Argentine position, which turned into a minor battle. The raid was beaten off, but it had succeeded in its mission of damaging their position. With the raids continuing, the Alliance needed a response. In March of 1866, the Brazilian Navy arrived and started bombarding the Paraguayan fort of Itaperu, a stronghold they would need to confront in the future. After causing severe damage, the Alliance decided to finally make a move, and in mid-April, a force of 14,000 troops crossed the river with the intent of capturing Itaperu and destroying the Paraguayan encampment. They encountered little resistance, and the operation succeeded in its objectives on day one. The next day there was a small Paraguayan counterattack of 1,600 troops, but this was easily swatted. Seeing the swelling ranks of his enemy, Lopez ordered his troops to leave the position and retreat to Estero Bejaco. Undeterred, the Alliance pressed forward, and by the end of April were already closing in on Lopez's position. Lopez ordered another minor strike of some 5,000 against the Uruguayan division headed by President Flores himself on the 2nd of May. Flores was taken completely by surprise and surrounded. His troops had to resist a fierce attack for several hours, suffering heavy casualties before being relieved by a larger Brazilian force. It is highly likely that Flores could have been captured and killed in this engagement. Throughout May, the Alliance organized and regrouped its force in the marshlands of Tuyuti, which was now numbering around 32,000, and preparing to advance on Lopez once more. Lopez knew this, and decided to launch an all-out offensive on the 24th of May with an army of 24,000. No one may have known it at the time, but it was this decision that ended up creating the biggest battle in South American history. The ensuing clash has come to be referred to as the Waterloo of South America for its sheer scale. In launching such a bold attack, Solano Lopez intended to surprise and scatter his enemy, and force the Alliance to retreat back over the Paraná River outside of Paraguayan borders. He regrouped his army into 4 attacking columns, which included a total of 17 infantry battalions and 14 cavalry regiments, whilst backed by a considerable artillery battery. All 4 columns had to attack simultaneously across a large area of land, which meant coordination was paramount for success. Once they were in position, just before midday, the assault commenced. To the east, Paraguayan cavalry regiments charged the Argentinian encampment, routing the first lines of defense. In the center, 2 columns comprising largely of infantrymen charged forward, meeting the Brazilian defenders. Despite being bogged down by the terrain, the attackers got to the enemy encampment, getting close enough to begin a vicious melee of swords and bayonets. The column in the west was able to take the enemy by surprise, destroying a weak and small force and pressing forward. The sudden attack had caused panic amongst the Allies, and there was a moment where it seemed like the Paraguayans were going to envelop and rout their enemy. Yet, despite having the initiative, Paraguayans were slowed by a valiant and desperate defense by the Allies, who were now fighting back fiercely. On the ground, a horrendous level of carnage was witnessed, and first-hand accounts talk of men and horses alike being torn to shreds by artillery and bayonets. The cacophony of swords, guns, and cannons must have created a spectacular, albeit traumatizing scene for everyone involved. It was not long before the marshes were being filled with mutilated corpses and body parts. The Allies were making very effective use of their artillery, which was steadily destroying the Paraguayan advance and inflicting unsustainable casualties. Their weapons were also proving superior, with the Paraguayan muskets proving ineffective against the Allied rifles. The wetness of the terrain was also an obstacle, as deep, muddy fords kept impeding their progress. Soon, the Paraguayan advance had come to a halt after the central columns had failed to capture the entrenched position known as the Fosso de Mallet, which, despite taking heavy fire, managed to hold its ground, becoming the deadliest epicenter of the battle. In the west, Paraguayans had almost been able to reach the Alliance main camp, but it had also been dragged down by fierce defenders. A similar story played out in the east, where the attackers were unable to get through to the second line of the Argentine dugouts. Desperate, Lopez ordered the flanking columns to make a final assault in an attempt to envelop the defenders in the middle, yet these had suffered too many losses to make any effective maneuvers. Sensing the advantage, the Allies mounted a wave of cavalry counterattacks which decimated the flanking columns, forcing them to scatter, which turned into a rout, with some regiments being completely annihilated. After 4 hours of fighting, the Paraguayans were in retreat, and the assault was over. They had suffered roughly 6,000 losses, compared to the Alliance, which had only taken 1,000. It was an unmitigated disaster for Lopez, who had lost some of his best men and most of his horses. Despite their decisive victory, the Alliance did not press their advantage, choosing not to conduct any major counteroffensive for the next few months. This is partly due to a massive strain they were having in logistics, as keeping their soldiers supplied and fed whilst so far from home was proving to be a far greater challenge than had been thought. Their ranks were also racked by epidemics of cholera and smallpox, and High Command decided that despite having the advantage, an attack was simply not merited. This, however, was likely a bad decision, since Lopez took the time to reinforce his ranks and build defences. This is all while sending small-scale raids into enemy positions to harass and loot, like they had done in the Paraná River. The morale of the Allied troops started to dwindle as they died of illness in their trenches whilst seeing no action. Back at home, demands for peace became louder. In Argentina, there were complaints against President Mitter's prolonged use of the army in a war which was no longer seen as having personal significance for the people, and many did not like the fact that they had entered an alliance with Brazil, a historic enemy. Uruguay was seeing its own share of anti-war rhetoric, with opposition occurring in both liberal and conservative parties. September of 1866 saw peace talks between Mitre and Lopez on the possibility of a settlement, proposing that the Paraguayan dictator be temporarily exiled to Europe and the borders of Paraguay restored. Nothing came of this, and the war continued. Wanting to regain the initiative, the Alliance decided to launch an offensive to take the stronghold at Humaitá on September 1866, which was far behind the front lines of Tuyutí. Humaitá was one of the most impressive fortresses on the continent, being built up during the reign of Antonio Lopez, and served as a stronghold in the way of the capital, Asunción, which meant that if it fell, victory would be in sight. The advance was slow and disorganized, and numerous mistakes were made. The Brazilians had originally wanted to bombard the enemy position with the guns from their ironclad ships, but the Paraguayan land artillery proved to be far more effective, and ended up destroying the Brazilian ship, the Rio de Janeiro. Forced to do things the hard way, the Allies attacked the entrenched position in Curuçu with an amphibious army of 8,000. The soldiers guarding Curuçu retreated back to their main base at Curubaití, allowing the Alliance to come within striking distance. On the 22nd of September, they launched their attack of 18,000 against the entrenchment. The operation was a complete disaster, as their artillery was ineffective, and their infantry stumbled on the muddy terrain whilst being bombarded by more effective Paraguayan cannons. Brazilian ships tried to shell the enemy trenches, but once again this proved ineffective. On the ground, an absolute bloodbath ensued, with scores of Brazilians and Argentinians being torn apart by grapeshot as they charged the enemy. After a few hours, the attack was called off, but only after losing 4,000 men. Paraguay had only lost around 100, making this the worst defeat for the Alliance. After this catastrophe, the Alliance made no action for roughly 10 months, and the war became a total stalemate. Lopez, massively boosted by his victory, decided to dig in and refuse to give even the slightest concession to his enemies. It was during this period that it seemed like the war really was going to end in a stalemate, with neither side being able to achieve their objectives. Once again, attempts were made at a peaceful compromise, yet the stubbornness of Lopez to make any concessions, combined with the insistence from Brazil that Lopez be removed, destroyed these talks. There were still many on the Alliance who were convinced that total victory was still possible. Among these was the Duke of Caxias, who, having just been made overall commander of the Allied effort, decided that it was time to formulate a new strategy to crush the enemy once and for all. The first major change he implemented was a reform in reconnaissance gathering, as he noted that one of the key reasons for the disaster at Curupaití was a lack of intelligence. This was alongside reforms in command structure and the dismissal of inept officers. Caxias wanted to besiege Humaitá with warships instead of attacking it. Once this was complete, an offensive against the positions at Utuyutí could commence. Whilst it would be some time before his plan could be realized, he now had a roadmap to victory. It was in August of 1867 that the Alliance decided to resume offensive operations after a long period of gathering their strength. The large fortress of Humaitá soon found itself being surrounded as Brazilian warships parked along the river and prevented supplies from being brought in. The situation became dire when an amphibious force took the town of Daí, just north of Humaitá on the 2nd of November. Reading the situation, Lopez panicked. He knew that his position in Tuyutí, which had held out for over a year and a half, was in danger of becoming encircled. Yet instead of retreating, he decided to repeat the past. On the same day that Daí fell, he ordered a second assault at Tuyutí, with an attack numbering around 9,000 troops. The plan was strikingly similar to the previous time he attacked this position. Instead, this time they had even less force. Unsurprisingly, it was just as disastrous as the first battle, and Paraguay lost around 2,000 men, compared to the Allies, who lost less than 100. Once again, this theatre of the war remained static, whilst Caxias continued to tighten his noose around Humaitá. The Brazilian fleet had been steadily building up its forces and blockading the fortress. On the 19th of February of 1868, they opened fire on some of the Paraguayan defences and blew them away. The defenders tried to return fire, but the weapons were ineffective against the armoured ships. Humaitá was now at the total mercy of the enemy. Desperate, Lopez ordered a last-ditch effort to relieve the fortress. On the 2nd of March, Paraguayan troops prepared small canoes and sailed across the river with the intent to board and capture the enemy navy. The operation was a complete disaster, and every man who partook in this mission was killed. Soon afterwards, on the 21st of March, the Alliance finally made a bold move down south against the Paraguayan encampment at Tuyutí, which had held out for almost 2 years. This attack became a rout, and within a few days, a large land army was marching north towards Humaitá. The defences at Curupaití, which had languished under siege, were easily overcome this time, and the fortress now found itself completely surrounded under the constant bombardment. It finally surrendered on the 24th of July, after a few more months. Lopez, and what was left of his army, were forced to retreat north and build a new line of defences at Angostura, which was just south of Asunción. Caxias, however, did not want to get bogged down whilst on a roll, instead deciding to embark on a daring manoeuvre that involved landing further north in San Antonio, and flanking his enemy from behind. In early December of 1868, around 19,000 Allied troops landed behind Paraguayan lines and launched an assault against the enemy. This was the beginning of what became known as La Decembrada, meaning December offensive. Shocked, Lopez sent 5,000 troops to meet this incursion, but they were soundly defeated at the Battle of Utororo, rushed down by a heroic charge led by none other than Caxias himself. The contingent was forced to retreat to the stream of Avai, where they were fully wiped out after being encircled with the cavalry flanking. Lopez and his men were forced to retreat once more to their final line at Lomas Valentinas. It was here where Lopez and the remnants of his army made one final stand against the Brazilian onslaught. On the 21st of December, Caxias arrived and launched an assault of 18,000 against the position. His attack was divided into two slowly advancing columns, supported by a powerful artillery. The Paraguayans, despite only numbering 3,000, fought tooth and nail with everything they had, using the last of their artillery pieces and functioning guns, as well as using child soldiers that had been hastily drafted from the home front. They dug a deep line of trenches and camped in them, often armed with little more than spears and swords. Despite their lack of equipment, they fought with an extreme ferocity that greatly slowed down the attackers, and even forced them to slightly retreat on the first day of the assault. The hilly terrain aided them in this, as they possessed the high ground. Some troops had managed to enter the defending trenches, where they engaged in a horrific melee that saw men being gutted by bayonets and beheaded with swords, yet they were repulsed. The next 4 days saw a pause in the fighting, with Caxias ordering his men to retreat and regroup to prepare for another assault. Lopez did the same and took the time to improve his defences. After gathering strength and swelling his numbers to around 32,000, Caxias renewed the attack on the morning of Christmas Day with a deadly cannon barrage that caused mayhem in the trenches, followed by an infantry and cavalry charge. Both sides took heavy losses, and despite the overwhelming numbers on the Allied side, the Paraguayans were still able to drag them down for another day, using weapons they had captured from the enemy in previous fights, firing artillery that dismembered the enemy at close range, whilst sharpshooters picked off commanders. It was also extremely rainy, creating mud sinks that were knee-deep and caused weapons to malfunction. Yet the Allied attack did not relent and pressed on throughout the day, leaving a trail of carnage in its wake. By the next day, the Allies had made it through a large part of the defences. The final assault began on the 27th, with another punishing artillery barrage. The Paraguayans had been left emaciated and exhausted, and by the time the Allies charged, they collapsed and were completely destroyed. Lopez took around 100 men with him and fled the area. Some Brazilian cavalrymen tried to give him pursuit, but he was able to avoid capture. The Battle of Lomas Valentinas had been a costly victory for the Alliance, but the last of Paraguay's conventional warfighting forces had been eradicated, and all that was left now was to occupy the country and hunt down Lopez. Paraguayan society at war had evolved into an almost Spartan-like place under Solano Lopez. With the massive losses being suffered at the front, he had taken to drafting anyone he could into his army, including children, elderly men, and women, although a little fewer of the latter. Weapons and supplies had dwindled to almost nothing because of the Allied blockade, and Paraguayan troops found themselves even less equipped than they were when the war started. Ammunition had run almost completely dry, and many could no longer afford to even use a rifle, so took to simply using swords or other sharp weapons instead. In the last year of the war, the army consisted of large numbers of boys armed with sticks that had been painted to look like guns. Lopez's police state had become increasingly brutal, with thousands being executed under charges of treason for questioning their leaders' decisions, opposing the war, or for any other minor alleged offence. Society had also been hit by severe food shortages that verged on famine due to the constant requisitioning of food for the war effort. Paraguay had effectively become a giant, starving, open-air prison for its people. Lopez refused to ever give up the war and surrender to enemy terms, even after the decisive defeat at Lomas Valentinas. But what is strange is how common Paraguayan people continued with such a futile resistance against the enemy, remaining for the most part obedient to Lopez. It is entirely possible that the unusual levels of patriotism within the Paraguayan mind, combined with their isolation and distrust of outsiders, caused them to resist the invaders to the bitter end, and seeing them walk over and plunder their homeland filled them with nationalist rage. Another explanation is Lopez's sheer control over the country and his insistence to keep fighting. Yet this notion has been challenged, as Thomas Whigham writes, quote, "In explaining the Paraguayans' protracted resistance after 1867, it is easy to emphasize Solano Lopez's personal obduracy, but to delve more generally into his psyche is not easy. The Marshal's analysis does not lend itself to precise analysis. His actions, moreover, have been so consistently lauded or vilified in the polemical literature that he often appears as a personification of good or evil and as a human being with shortcomings or idiosyncrasies." Unquote. Whigham does try to give good reasons behind why the war went on for so long, and the implacable resistance of Lopez and his people. Yet the real answer to this may never be conclusive. It is one of those historical enigmas which may never be resolved, and is well beyond the scope of this documentary. Yet no matter how hard Paraguay may have resisted, the Allies were still dead set on finding Lopez, and until then, the war was going to continue. The Paraguayan capital of Asunción was captured on the 1st of January of 1869, soon after Caxias's Decembrada campaign. It didn't fall with much resistance, as practically the entire standing army of Paraguay had been eradicated. The Brazilian troops simply marched in and assumed control. After this point, the Paraguayan state had ceased to exist, and the Allies had set about creating a provisional government made up of any Paraguayans they could find, and put the country under occupation. With such a state of affairs, conventional battles were over, to the point that some historians considered the war to have ended with the fall of Asunción. Yet Lopez was still on the run, commanding a ragtag army of a few hundred he managed to scramble together after his final stand. The alliance needed time to recover from fighting, choosing not to begin a hunt for Lopez for several months. Caxias himself had to leave due to poor health, and was replaced with the emperor's son-in-law, the Count of Eu. This gave Lopez enough time to retreat to the countryside and amass an army of 9,000 men, who were mostly veterans from the conflict. Of course, this was not large enough to challenge the Brazilian army in open battle, so he chose to conduct a guerrilla war instead, raiding outposts and stealing weapons. Count Eu became alert to this, and began the final campaign to rid Lopez in May of 1869. Despite their massive numerical superiority, the Brazilians still encountered obstacles, namely resistance from the countryside, which was not at all under their control, which meant they had to violently subdue the small garrisons still in these areas. Nevertheless, the Count gave chase to his enemy in what became known as the Hills Campaign. Lopez fled north and created a detachment to intercept and slow the pursuer down. This force consisted of mostly children and was massacred at the Battle of Campo Grande. At this point, most of Lopez's men were choosing to desert or remain and die of starvation. After several more months of retreating and small-scale skirmishing, the dictator was finally cornered at Cerro Corra on the 1st of March of 1870. His army, which now only numbered at around 500, was surrounded and destroyed. Lopez was killed with a sword in hand, and is famously reported to have shouted, "Muero con mi patria!" I die with my country. After almost 7 years of fighting, the war was over. Approximately 80,000 Allied troops gave their lives to the subjugation of Paraguay, with most of them being Brazilian, although that country could easily afford this loss given its massive population. The people of the Allied countries felt relieved that the war was finally over, but this was hardly because they hated Paraguay, and more because they now no longer had to shoulder the maintenance of such massive armies. In fact, the general public among the Alliance had become ambivalent to the war, as it had gone on for so long and its causes had been largely forgotten. Paraguay had been utterly destroyed and ceased to be a real threat. It is unclear exactly how much blood Paraguay lost in the war, but all can agree that the sheer level of destruction inflicted on it was going to take decades, and maybe even a century, to recover from. Roughly 300,000 Paraguayans had died in 7 years, almost 2/3 of its pre-war population, with many being killed in battle, and many more having died from the natural causes that were as a result of war, including disease and starvation. Lopez had conscripted so many men to fight that around 90% of Paraguay's pre-war male population had died, giving the country one of the highest gender imbalances in history, with an estimated female-to-male ratio of 4 to 1. Paraguayan agriculture had been left largely neglected, and with many more of the country's farmers now dead, food shortages were endemic. The police force had been completely consumed, which led to a breakdown of law and public order throughout the country. The provisional government that had been created after the capture of Asunción had an almost impossible task of regenerating the nation. It had been mainly composed of Paraguayan deserters and defectors who were anti-Lopez, being placed into power by the Alliance. The state they formed was forced to take drastic authoritarian measures to fix many social ills, which included rounding up civilians to force them to work on public projects and infrastructure, and banishing people to the rural areas to turn them into farmhands. Given the extreme gender imbalance, they were forced to turn a blind eye to the high level of polygamy that was occurring, as men could now accumulate large harems of women, with some men having relations with dozens of spouses at any given time. The church in Paraguay protested and condemned the liberal attitude the authorities now had to sexual immorality, yet even they were forced to admit that at this time, enforcing traditional Catholic values was impossible. In the next few decades, Paraguay was a helpless and dependent nation which repeatedly had to ask its former enemies for aid with a destroyed economy. Brazil reluctantly agreed on occasions, promising limited provisions. Even so, Paraguay was going to be forced to make a number of diplomatic and political concessions to the victors, who all wanted their share of the spoils of war. It is a little strange that after being defeated so thoroughly, Paraguay was not completely absorbed by Brazil and Argentina, the latter of whom expressed interest in the past for its total annexation. Indeed, it was certainly possible for the Allies to have taken all of Paraguay's territory if they wanted, as the vanquished country was simply in no position to resist a permanent occupation. Yet, through a number of diplomatic and political factors, Paraguay would ultimately be spared its existence. To begin with, the rivalry between Brazil and Argentina still very much existed, and fears of future conflict between the two were present amongst the Brazilians. Unlike Argentina, Brazil never had an interest in taking all of Paraguay, merely re-annexing the areas it had lost in Mato Grosso. Instead, it believed that Paraguay was best left as a buffer state between it and its old rival, yet Argentina protested against this decision. Ultimately, Paraguay's independence was secured from an unlikely source, that being a diplomatic intervention by the United States President Rutherford B. Hayes. The Allies had asked for foreign mediation in 1878, a year after Hayes won his presidential election. Hayes ruled in November of 1878 that Paraguay should make territorial concessions but remain an independent state. Today, Hayes is a largely forgotten president in American history, but in Paraguay, he is celebrated as a national hero, with there being numerous portraits and monuments of him throughout the country, and there are several Paraguayan sites that bear his name in thanks for this ruling. Nevertheless, Paraguay was forced to give up around 40% of its pre-war territory. This included all of their gains in the Mato Grosso region to the north, and several provinces to the south in Argentina, including a considerable portion of the Gran Chaco region, which totals to roughly 140,000 square kilometers of land. By the end of the decade, the Allied troops had left the country and peace resumed. Paraguay, despite being in ruins, gradually recovered over the course of the late 19th century. With the bloodiest war in the history of South America over, the Allied troops could finally return home to their families and build their societies in peace. Yet with this came a number of other challenges, as these nations were in the early phases of industrialization and were undergoing painful political transformations. By far the most positive story was that of Argentina, as once the war had ended, the constant insurrections and civil strife that were caused by federalists and warlords mostly came to an abrupt end. The country used its fertile farmland to sell large amounts of cheap food to Europe and gained the wealth needed to undergo a rapid modernization by importing and manufactured goods and expertise, primarily from Britain. Millions of immigrants from Italy and Spain traveled there to find work, turning the country into an immigrant haven. By 1900, it was one of the wealthiest societies in the world, and on course to having a functional and civil democracy. However, this growth concealed underlying flaws in its development, as its heavy reliance on food exports made it vulnerable to market fluctuations. The economic uncertainties of the 20th century made this very clear, as economic depressions and financial crises destroyed Argentinian prosperity. Uruguay suffered significant upheavals in the late 19th century. President Venancio Flores returned from the war to lead the Colorado Party and established firm control over the country to keep the Blancos under his thumb. This peace was disrupted when his own party began to have internal splits, dividing into sub-parties. Polarization returned, and the election of 1873 ended up being so contentious that the army was forced to mount a coup d'etat due to a week of violent riot in the capital to restore order. This led to the Tricolor Revolution of 1875, where a liberal group called the Principistas tried to overthrow the government, but were crushed. In 1876 there was another coup, which put Uruguay under the rule of a junta until 1890. Only after that did the country begin to see a semblance of stability. Brazil also had a troubled post-war era. The country was gradually in the process of abolishing slavery thanks to the campaigning by Emperor Pedro II, who was highly opposed to the practice. Because of its massive reliance on slaves to grow coffee, a major export at the time, it was only until 1888 when it was finally outlawed, making Brazil the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. However, this made the monarchy unpopular with the slave-owning elites, who conspired with the army to overthrow Pedro in 1889. From there, the first Brazilian republic was established, and in theory, it was meant to bring progress to a backward nation. Yet the new constitution only served to entrench the power of the plantation tycoons, especially in the wealthy province of Sao Paulo, into an oligarchic elite. The irony is that the monarchy had been a progressive force in Brazilian politics, since Pedro was someone who cared for the common people and facilitated the passing of egalitarian legislation. Under the Republic, however, politics came to be dominated by a small minority of wealthy landowners who ostensibly rigged the system to always be in their favor, keeping former slaves illiterate and politically powerless. Latin America did experience progress during this age, yet it was a progress that was very much directed by oligarchic elites which focused on simple agrarian economies based on exports with a neglect for complex industry or the emancipation of the common people. Liberal positivism very much became the dominant ideology of the region, which was essentially a technocratic and authoritarian version of liberalism which idolized progress and rationalism whilst having an elitist view of society, condescendingly seeing the masses as backwards and savage, and the oligarchs as the civilized and educated rulers who could bring a country into the modern era. This only created extremely rigid and authoritarian regimes, which were more often than not detrimental to the well-being of their countries. The best example of this being the brutal dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, who modernized his country with no regard for the common good. Edwin Williamson writes, quote, "As the export economies flourished in the major countries, ideological conflicts subsided, and on the whole, liberals took control of the state." either by constitutional means or by establishing progressive dictatorships. The romantic liberalism which had inspired the struggles for liberty and political rights during the Middle decades was superseded by a more hard-headed doctrine which appealed to science in order to justify political leadership of the white elites of the multiracial nations of Latin America. In republics with large non-white populations, this kind of scientific politics came very close to artificially sanctioned racism. Indians, mestizos, and blacks tended to be regarded as irredeemably unskilled, indeed as obstacles to the nation's progress." Unquote. This crude ideology, combined with the Spanish colonial legacy and a dependence on foreign exports, ensured that the next 100 years for Latin America would be dominated by authoritarianism, massive wealth inequality, political instability, military insubordination, backwards economies, and oligarchic governments, which, contrary to what they claimed, were profoundly unscientific. Paraguay experienced a gradual recovery from the apocalypse it had suffered. Of course, this took quite a while, as such an incredible loss of life for a population is only comparable to peoples who have suffered from actual genocides, such as the Jews during World War II or the Armenians during World War I. Nevertheless, progress was gradually achieved in what became known as La Regeneración, or the regeneration. The gender imbalance was eventually healed, and the rural areas were in time repopulated. Of course, life was still incredibly hard for ordinary Paraguayans, who were often employed in slave-like conditions on the country's yerba plantations and timber yards, for, at best, minimal pay, and at worst, state-sponsored indentured slavery. This occurred at the backdrop of increasing political polarization in the country. The Paraguayan government was mostly constituted of defectors during the Lopez years, who sought to create a liberal government. They began to face fierce opposition in the later decades by Lopez loyalists. The dynamic that formed was very similar to that of the polarization in Uruguay, and there were several occasions where the country verged on outright civil war. There was even a similar international dynamic, with Argentina and Brazil backing different factions against one another to gain influence, just as they had done in Uruguay. There was a period between 1904 and 1922 where the country was so unstable it had 15 different presidents in 18 years. This was only interrupted when civil war did break out in 1923, when the Liberals overthrew the government and forced the military to intervene and crush them. Just as this was happening, Paraguay soon found itself fighting another conflict against its northwestern neighbor, Bolivia. Both countries had an ongoing dispute over the Gran Chaco Desert, which was speculated to contain large amounts of oil. The region has never been demarcated by the Spanish Empire, however, so once again, it was up to the independent nations to figure out where the boundary lay, and since neither could come to a civil agreement on the issue, war broke out in 1932. The fighting devolved into vicious and protracted trench warfare, characterized by immense human suffering on either side. The Paraguayans kept launching idiotic frontal assaults against enemy positions, which costed many lives for little gain. Meanwhile, the Bolivian supply lines were so disorganized and overstretched that most of their troops died of thirst and malnutrition. The Paraguayans fought with greater determination and understood the land better, and so despite their blunders, were able to hold on to most of the disputed territory. Paraguay won the Gran Chaco Desert in 1935 with the Treaty of Buenos Aires. Unfortunately, it turned out that there was no oil there, and the area has remained an unsettled wasteland. Around 100,000 people died in a war that served no real use for either side. The public in Paraguay felt extremely angered at the massive loss of life over nothing, which prompted even more political instability. There was a military coup d'etat in 1936 led by General Rafael Franco, who ruled until 1940 when he was himself deposed by the Nazi sympathizer Higinio Morínigo, who ruled until 1947. He then fell from power after Rafael Franco organized another coup d'etat with liberals. The coup failed, but it triggered a large wave of riots all over Paraguay demanding Morínigo's resignation, who responded with extreme brutality, invoking the army to violently crush all dissent. This culminated in the Second Paraguayan Civil War, which killed an estimated 20,000. Morínigo eventually lost and was forced to step down in 1948. allowing the country to transition to a provisional government. Unfortunately, this government ended up being highly corrupt and unstable, and came to an end when a general named Alfredo Stroessner successfully performed yet another military conspiracy in 1945, which installed him as an absolute dictator. Stroessner ruled Paraguay with an iron fist for 35 years, and his regime was characterized by right-wing authoritarianism and economic liberalization, making him a firm American ally during the Cold War. His economic policies helped industrialize and grow his nation, but also massively exacerbated wealth inequality to the point that around 1.6% of the country owned 80% of the land by 1980, according to an Oxfam report, making it one of the most unequal countries on the planet. He used secret police to fight worker unions and any potential political rivals with gross human rights abuses, which included torture, arbitrary executions, and concentration camps. This included becoming one of the leading members of the infamous Operation Condor, which was a joint project by several Latin American states with the help of the CIA to exterminate leftists in the region using state terror. Stroessner was also responsible for the Aceh genocide of the 1970s, who were an uncontacted tribe and one of Paraguay's last indigenous inhabitants. This was effectively a campaign of mass killings, systematic rape, enslavement, and child abduction in order to clear their ancestral land to build industrial projects. This program of extermination was so thorough that today there are only a few hundred Aceh left. To top it all off, he was also a pedophile and serial rapist who may have had as many as 30 legitimate children. A Truth and Justice Commission established in 2003 did not have anything flattering to say about Stroessner's record. Quote, "The dictatorship brutally repressed members of banned and clandestine organizations, both political and armed, members of communist organizations, popular opposition leaders, and professional military personnel opposed to the regime. The repressive state machinery oversaw the massacre of indigenous people and allowed the trafficking of indigenous boys and girls. Acts of sexual violence, predominantly against women, adolescents, and young girls, constituted a serious violation of human rights that was encouraged by the structures of the system, to the point where senior officers of the regime used young girls as sex slaves." Unquote. Stroessner's rule faltered during the 1980s when his nation suffered from severe economic setbacks. Realizing his weakness and lack of popularity, rival general Andrés Rodriguez launched a putsch in 1989 and forced the dictator to leave the country. Paraguayans were finally able to vote in free and fair elections in 1993, and the nation has been a fairly stable, albeit somewhat dysfunctional republic ever since. As of the making of this documentary, Paraguay is mostly on reasonable terms with its former enemies. Brazil and Argentina are its top trading partners, and have not had any violent border disputes since. It is currently a member of Mercosur, the South American trade bloc established in 1991, and whose members are the 4 nations that participated in the war, strangely enough. However, despite its promises to bring the nations together both economically and politically, it has proven to be quite dysfunctional in recent decades, as it has failed to pass the policies required to make this happen and overcome divisions. This is not helped by the fact that the larger countries involved are having major internal problems. Brazil is having high levels of political division between the left and the right, which has been recently spiraling into violence. Meanwhile, Argentina is suffering from its latest bout of hyperinflation, and is currently ruled by an anarcho-capitalist maniac who is not solving the problem. Economic growth has also been uneven, and Paraguay has not received the bulk of the prosperity which the bloc has provided. As a result, many Paraguayans are feeling somewhat disgruntled, and occasionally, vague memories of the old war surface that inflame bickering during negotiations. Whilst they are no longer at arms, these countries have a long way to go and many issues to resolve. The bloodiest war in South American history has received little attention from historians. Almost no research has been conducted on the war's impact on state building, economic development, social change, or national identity. The writing of secondary literature was mostly concentrated in the middle of the 20th century, yet it seems publications stopped coming after the 1970s. Today, the most known Western historian on the issue is Thomas Whigham, whose works were used extensively in the making of this documentary. Yet beyond him, there is not much. It seems that Paraguay's isolation and the continent's lack of importance has left this war mostly forgotten in both academia and the public. There have been almost no films on the subject. The only one I was able to find was the 1978 war drama Cerro Corra, and being fluent in Spanish, I was able to watch it. Unfortunately, it is rather crap in my opinion, and I was not able to find an English translation. What is even stranger is Paraguay's modern idolization of Solano Lopez, the man who almost brought his own country into extinction. Today there are several museums and monuments dedicated to his honor, such as the museum in Paso de la Patria, where his statue bears the motto Vencer o Morir, meaning victory or death. The opinion is not held by all citizens of Paraguay, but an alarming number believe Lopez to have been the country's greatest national hero. It seems that Paraguayan nationalism has superseded a critical analysis of history. The early 20th century Paraguayan writer Delosio Gonzalez once wrote, Paraguay, at once the most heroic and the poorest country in the Americas, a country in continual contemplation of its past, lulled by the gentle murmur of its epic history, looks very much like a restaging in the New World the role of Sparta in the Old. God save us from such glory. As a modern writer has said, poor nations are like tramps. They live on crumbs and past glories. Paraguay is arguably the archetype of this phenomenon. Unquote. Nationalist narratives have also spawned the myth that the British Empire was behind the whole war in the first place. Many documentaries, news articles, and books from the region allege that Britain was the quote, fourth ally. A Guardian article published in 2021, interviewing Brazilian historian Alfredo da Mota de Menezes, spoke about this and how it was mostly fabricated to ease nationalist pride. Apparently, Solano Lopez was a great leader who was cornered by the British and his puppet states, who committed genocide against the Paraguayan people. This narrative, of course, is not taken seriously by historians who don't have a nationalist agenda, but it has prevailed as a popular myth in Paraguay. Regardless of what Paraguayans may think, they certainly shook a continent despite their small size, even although the world has mostly forgotten about it. It was a war fought with unimaginable determination for complex political machismo, and whilst the annals of law have neglected the place, Paraguay truly is a remarkable nation with an amazing history.